Assalamu alaikum. I'm back with the third talk on the series of reading a scientific paper. And today I'm going to talk about the problem of poor quality journals. As I have mentioned many times, that my talks are intended for people who are ambitious about science. And for anybody who is ambitious about science, it's very important to understand that what is the quality of material that they are reading. And unfortunately, most journals that are available there are of poor quality, and I'll explain this from scientific data in my talk. And that's why it's very important for good scientists, good academicians to understand what is a poor quality journal and how to stay away from it. Now, in this talk, I'm not going to talk about good quality journals. That will be the topic of my next talk, inshallah. Now, scientific publishing has become a business over the last number of years, especially over the last 10-15 years. So a lot of groups have emerged, and this is because many developing countries, they took a wrong direction in terms of science and research. They wanted to promote science and research, and I've personally followed what HEC in Pakistan was doing about 20 or 15 years ago, and I was very disappointed and displeased with what it was doing and its approach at the time. And obviously that approach has resulted in a bad outcome because Pakistan has not improved in terms of its global ranking when it comes down to innovation, science, and those sort of things. And the problem is because you cannot connect science with a make it a money-making instrument in terms of publishing. So when those countries that tied publications with promotions and financial incentives, they basically were talking about quantity production, not quality production. Especially in countries where they were not that lacked expertise to promote good quality research and good quality publishing. So because of that push in many developing countries, and Pakistan was not alone in that, many groups internationally, they came up with this idea about why not use this opportunity as a money-making opportunity. And so thousands of journals came into existence in the last 10-15 years that are basically a lot of them are what we call them as predatory journals. Now, just in medicine alone, it is estimated that there are about 30,000 journals across the globe. And I'm talking about medicine alone, not about social sciences or psychology, not about physical sciences, not about humanities, political sciences, history, and those subject matters. Medical sciences alone, there are about 30,000 journals. If we quantify them, if we rank them in terms of their quality, a majority of them is basically of poor quality. And then there are some of fair quality, and then there are some of good quality. And this is not my opinion only. This is, of course, my observation as well, having been a reviewer for tens of journals over the course of last 25 years and making my way gradually up to the top ranked global journals. So based on that experience, as well as what scientific data tells us, that most of the journals are basically of poor quality. The poor quality journals fall into two categories. One, they are called predatory journals, which are basically just very poor quality journals that aim at making money. And then there are journals that are poor quality, but they have good intention. They are trying to work for science, but they don't have the necessary resources and expertise to build themselves up. I'm not going to talk too much about the low resource journals, but I'm going to talk about the predatory journals to give you an idea about what scientific literature says about those journals. Now, a few years ago, the predatory journals issue is not new. And I know, based on my discussions with a number of academic colleagues in Pakistan over the last 10 years, the idea is very unusual for those academicians in those countries. But predatory journals idea is at least 10 years old, and it started evolving as these journals that are basically take money from the authors to publish their material started to crop up very rapidly. So a few years ago, experts from scientists, experts, publishers, they got together from across the globe, I think 10 or 12 countries. There were total about 30 or 35 individuals. And they said, we have to define what a predatory journal is. Essentially, they defined a predatory journal as the journal that prioritizes self-interest at the expense of scholarship. So it's a journal that will compromise scientific integrity or ethical integrity for self-interest, and the self-interest from the journal side is mostly making money. So they will their self-interest is to make money. They will be characterize themselves by false or misleading information. So they use advertising techniques that are misleading. They deviate from best editorial and publication practices that ensure ethics and good quality practices. And they lack transparency about their whole process and how they publish. And they use business methods or promotion methods that are coercive, and they don't take care into conflict of interest and those things. Now, the predatory journals issue, as I said, has been identified for at least 10 years. So some groups scientists try to build up groups that will identify such groups. They will list those groups, and then they will try to promote awareness about those journals. And one of those groups was Beale's group. But then those like Beale's group, they started receiving legal threats, and they closed down in 2017. Then there are certain groups that follow scientific literature and data and in a more structured manner, and because they use a more structured method, they will identify predatory. They can identify journals based on their content and their quality. So those groups, Cabell's will be an example of that group, and they will identify predatory journals as well. So it's not something that only a few experts talk about. This is something that is a well-known global phenomenon. Now, when it comes down to academics, most people are aware of the Clarivate group. This is a group that runs the Web of Science. So it has been there for, I don't know how long, 58, 70 years or what number of decades. And they follow all the scientific publications very closely. And they have very stringent criteria. Up till last year, they had 24 very well-defined criteria. They were transparent criteria. Everybody who wanted to know about those criteria, the authors, the publishers, the scientists, the politicians, whoever, they knew what the criteria were. They would use those criteria to assess the quality of scientific literature. Now, based on their 2022 data, they identified less than 22,000 journals from all the sciences, humanities, and arts as good quality journals. So on one side, there are 30,000 journals for medicine alone. But when it comes down to quality for all the sciences, medical sciences, engineering sciences, physical sciences, chemical sciences, social sciences, political science, every type of subject matter involving 254 research categories, there are basically 22,000 journals that are of good quality. And even not those 22,000, all of them are of good quality, as I will explain in the next slide. So these basically what Clarivate has determined is, or Web of Science has determined, is that less than 15% of the journals meet criteria that define a good quality journal. The problem doesn't stop there. The problem is that even within that 15% group, there are journals that are basically poor quality journals. And that's why Clarivate is trying to broaden the list from 24 criteria to include more criteria into it. Because this mushrooming of open access and predatory publishing and that sort of models that basically thrive on authors who want to pay from their own pocket has created a lot of problems. So even in the Clarivate's data itself, from 2022, in the data that it identified so many journals at good quality journal, it identified 50 journals from its own list that it had to delist. And then it identified 450 other journals that are still being reviewed because their quality is questionable, their standards, their processes are questionable. Importantly, they identified that one of the journals in the Web of Science listed groups was a journal that is highly ranked with an impact factor of 4.6, and they removed this journal as well. And the reason they removed it is because this journal published 17,000 papers in 1 year. And it basically just publishes online. It attracts, it was thriving on people who publish from their own pocket. And because research has picked up in the last, or publishing has picked up in the last 10 years or so in the developing countries, and because many academicians in those countries just cycle with the same type of journals that they are comfortable with, and they are the journals that they publish in because they have difficulty in getting their material published in journals that don't charge money because they publish only very high quality papers. So of course there's a lot of cross citationing, and that results in getting the impact factor high. So the impact factor is also not the best indicator in that sense, and we might have some discussion on it in the Facebook group, and I don't want to get into that discussion at this point. But the point here is that even if we consider 15% of the journals as good quality journals, within that 15%, there is a lot of journals that are not of good quality. So for anybody who is passionate about research, passionate about science, passionate about scientific methodology and knowledge, they need to understand three basic elements that basically drive poor quality research and poor quality journals. The first is both poor quality researchers and poor quality journals, they basically have material interest for personal sake. Usually it's about, for the poor quality journals, it's about making money by getting money out of the pockets of the authors. And for the authors, the personal material interest is that if they get their papers published and they can get so many published within so many years, they get promoted to the next level that not only gives them more benefits, that they get more pay as well. And they get a higher designation and more respect and all that stuff. So it's not about science, it's about paying the journal to get your paper published, and the journal makes money out of it, and the authors also hope that they will ultimately get promoted and they'll make money out of it too. And again, I'm not talking about this for everybody, but this is just the pattern and the cycle that in many cases the developing countries have fallen prey to. The second important thing to recognize what is poor quality research and how it connects with the poor quality journals is a disregard for the basic ethical principles. So I have been on a research ethics board in Canada. There are very stringent criteria. So even if someone has to have a very simple research that involves no issues with privacy, is just asking some simple questionnaire related information and all that, still there is a very robust process for it. But as you complicate, as the research becomes more complicated, more invasive, there are privacy issues, there are cost issues, there are issues about patient risks, there are issues related to cost to the patient, there are issues related to cost to the government. Then all those have to be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. So it's not like if I want, like I know in developing countries, and I know this because I know academicians in developing countries, it's not like you can just do a blood test on some patients and get the money for it from the patient's own pocket because the patient is going to pay for that blood test. And then 6 months later, once you have enough patients, you use that data and you say, look, I'm going to publish it. Because if you're going to get those tests for research purposes and there's no clinical indication for it, then your getting those tests for research purposes is unethical. So what happens is that when there are no good standards in terms of the researcher, from the researcher's end, then they have difficulty getting those papers published in high quality journals that are very tight on, that are very inquisitive, and they want good exact details about how the research happened, how the ethical principles were followed or not followed, how the Research Ethics Board was involved, and whether there was approval from that board or not. So that research ends up basically going to poor quality journals and getting published in those journals. Similarly, there will be authorship issues. So there are global criteria about who can be a co-author, who can be listed as a co-author. So someone who as a co-author has to have a designated task and must fulfill that task to be a co-author. So you can't simply write a name of the head of the department as a co-author because that person is the head of the department. If that head of department is not contributing anything to the paper in a meaningful way, then that person cannot be a co-author. Now, third important thing that basically gives the poor quality research and poor quality journals a symbiotic relationship is lack of attention to scientific robustness. So if someone, and here comes that cycle of lack of resources. So even if someone is a good scientist, he or she is motivated to become a good academician, wants to follow scientific principles, is passionate about science. If that person never got trained to do a good research, he or she inevitably will end up putting together a research project that is of poor quality. Now, if that is of poor quality, that paper is not going to get published in a good quality journal. So the end result will be that that person will end up having to submit that paper to a poor quality journal. And that's why I highlight that my effort is intended to, even if I can motivate 5% of academicians or 2% of academicians in my group to work on their academic robustness, work on their scientific robustness, then they can break that cycle. Because someone like me who has already moved up the ladder now does have little interest to join a mediocre journal as an on the editorial board or as a reviewer in that and try to lift it up, especially trying to work against the tide, because the editor won't not understand, the other reviewers might not understand my perspective. But if a young person who joins it and is improving his skills over time, then they can lift the journal alongside with them to boost its standard or international level or international quality as well. Now, the problem also is that because the developed countries are funding projects in the developing countries, so the funds from developed countries are going to developing countries for research projects that end up being of not good enough quality to be published in journals that do not publish that only publish good quality material, So that research also ends up getting published in poor quality journal. So a few years ago, 6 years ago, in fact, in a very well-known prestigious journal, The Nature, this paper came out where a number of people, they reviewed what was the funding resources for the literature getting published in poor quality journals. And they realized that a lot of funding was coming from the developed countries, including the National Institute of Health of the USA. And the reason again was because of that gap. So the funding sources were hoping that there will be good research at the receiving end, but somehow that research was not of a quality to be published in a journal of a good quality journal. So those funds basically ended up getting, as these researchers call it, it was basically a waste of money. So the good news, however, is that many countries, or at least some countries, have realized that they have been on the wrong path and they are trying to mend their course for the last few years. And India is an example in that regard. And they have been trying to make list of predatory or poor quality journals and try to improve the quality of, not focus on the quantity of research only, but the quality of research as well. Similarly, South Africa is also trying to do the same, that they're trying to disconnect the financial incentives or the promotional incentives from the quantity of the research. So the quality of the research is taking forefront in some countries because they realized that simply based on quantity, if you keep giving just on, you publish this many papers and you get promoted, then the end result will be basically people getting poor quality research published in poor quality journals. Now, this ends my talk here. And in the next talk, I'll focus on good quality journals and how you can make a list depending upon your areas of interest, and then you can learn from those journals over the course of years. Thank you very much. Bye.